All right, good evening. I don't know what Miss Elner did, but you ran everybody off. All right. Reminder for Wednesday night that we need volunteers to bring desserts. And then February the 27th, the youth planning meeting, February 27th at 5 o'clock. All hands on deck. Y'all know what that phrase, you know what the origin of that phrase was? That's a good Navy term, yeah. But especially back in the sailing days when they were getting into storms, they needed all hands on deck, all hands to come up to the deck, deck hands, that's what they were called, to come up on the deck to get the sails rigged for the storm. So all hands on deck. All right, any other announcements? CPR class is coming up in a couple of weeks too, so be here before you know it. All right, do we have any prayer requests? All right, Dalton, would you lead us in prayer, please?
Dear Heavenly Father, we're so grateful to be in your house and worship you. Pray for everybody that is not able to be here tonight, Father, for whatever reason. Father, you know the reason. We ask that you just place a special touch upon them. Bless those that come. Father, just bless Brother Bobby for his message that he's going to give us tonight. Thank you and praise you.
Amen. Okay, we are discussing the annual conference. Last time we met to discuss the discipline, we talked about the local church. So tonight we're going to look at the annual conference. What is the purpose of the annual conference? What is its role? Well, for the conference, for the annual conference, we're not at the general conference level yet. There's a distinction there, but it's the organizational structure to maintain the denomination in a regional area, and in our case, it's the Mississippi Conference, and it brings various members together to carry on the work of the conference. It's also one of the purposes is to help provide pastors for the local churches. In fact, that's one of the primary roles of the conference. The conference also is designed to provide for educational opportunities in the local area, the regional area as well. That's something that the general conference does as well, but more of an overview, an umbrella, if you will. What does the conference, or what does the annual conference do for us as a church? Provides a pastor. What else? I told you just a second ago. Huh? That's the general conference. Provide for educational opportunities. One of the outlets, or one of the ways that that's done, is through Bible camp each summer, each year. The Bible camp is put on by the, excuse me, actually by the Council of Religious Education, which is under the umbrella of the Board of Christian Education. We'll talk about that next week when we get into the General Conference and the boards. But the Council of Religious Education works under the auspices of the annual conference, and they provide the Bible training school or the Bible camp each summer. They sometimes do other things like the youth retreats. They have done concerts and different things like that. And so there are some things that are done through the annual conference to help provide opportunities for the local churches that provide educational opportunities for them. And those are some of the roles of the conference as well. I mentioned that it helps to provide a pastor. There are different ways that that's done. We'll get into more of that in a few minutes as we get into some of the different aspects of the conference. So who is a member of the conference? I'll go ahead and answer that for you. Membership consists of ministers, unstationed ministers, licensed preachers or itinerants, and the various churches that make up the conference. Superannuated ministers, and the various churches of the conference. So, in the state of Mississippi, for example, each ordained minister that's a member of the conference is a member of the conference. Those that are under the term is amenable to the conference. Do you understand what I mean when I say amenable to the conference? That means that that the ministers are answerable to the conference for behavior, for carrying out their duties, for their position as a minister. We are answerable to the annual conference. And so if, for example, and this is something that if we were to cover the, my mind just went blank. There's one section of the discipline that I'm not going to get into, but it covers some of the legal aspects. What's the term for it? Anyway, let's say, for example, charges are brought against a minister. If charges were brought against a minister for some reason, that would go to the annual conference, because the minister is answerable to the annual conference, not the local church. And the annual conference is the one that would oversee a trial or an investigation or whatever that would be involved in that. Thankfully, that's not something that we've had to do in quite a few years, and I hope we never do have to do it. But mm-hmm. 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 The member of the congregation would contact the president of the conference and let them know, and they would then, with the district committee, which we'll discuss later, will get into and do an investigation to determine whether charges are necessary or not, and to try to, the first thing before that's even done is to meet with the minister to go over the accusations, if you will, and to try to come to an understanding. And anytime that issues can be resolved without bringing charges is a win-win. If we ever have to go to a point of having a trial, then everybody loses. We've seen that in the past where we've had to have church trials, and it's not a good thing. And so we try to follow the biblical example, which is if your brother offends you, you go to him and you try to work that out. If they don't respond, then you go back with a friend. You go back with somebody else. Two of you go together. And if that doesn't happen, then you bring them before the church. And that's the same principle is the way that the conference or the denomination works as well. A minister must be recommended for membership by a church board, by an official church board, or another annual conference. This is not somebody entering into the ministry, but this is a minister that maybe is coming from another denomination, maybe they've been coming to church here and they say, I'd like to join the Methodist Protestant church. They join the church here, well then the local official church board would meet with them, and we would then make a recommendation to the conference, or another annual conference can do that, or they can make direct appeal to the president of the conference, and that would be a means of doing that as well. Yes.
Do we have a shortage of ordained ministers in our state this time?
Yes, we do. Every conference that I know of, and when I say every conference, I don't mean just Methodist Protestant. Every conference that I know of has a shortage of ministers today. I know the Baptists, the Methodists, Free Methodists, the Wesleyans, the Nazarenes, everybody that I know of that I've talked to are experiencing shortages in ministers. So let's briefly discuss the offices of the conference then, or officers, I guess is maybe that's kind of a combination. First of all is the president. The president of the conference is elected each year by the sitting members of the conference, and the president can hold that position for 5 consecutive years. After 5 consecutive years, there are term limits. They will have to be replaced, and someone else would be elected. The president resides over the sitting of the conference. They are the official chairman of the conference, if you will. They're the ones that preside. They have they're ex officio members of all of the committees, of all of the boards that come under the annual conference, and so they attend each of those meetings if and when possible. They also have some other duties as well. The president is supposed to visit the church, visit all of the churches. He can receive ministers, assign pastors, and basically just carry out the work of the conference in the interim between conferences. The secretary, primary duty of the secretary is to record the proceedings of the conference. So when conference meets, then the secretary keeps a record of everything that takes place. He's supposed to put that together in the form of the minutes and have those printed and delivered, with a copy being delivered to the general conference. The secretary also will preside over the conference in the absence of the president. So if for some reason during annual conference the president has to be away for meetings, then the secretary becomes the presiding officer at that point. The treasurer is just that, has responsibility to receive, disperse funds for the conference, to maintain the funds for the conference, and all the funds that are received from the various charges. And by charges, that's churches. Would be charges is the old term that's still in the discipline, but it's from all the churches. And does anybody know who our current annual conference treasurer is? You know who the president is? Brother Carlos is. You know who the secretary is? He's lacking in his duties because he hadn't gotten the minutes out yet, so that you would know that Henry Carmichael is our treasurer now. I've had a chat with him, and he just doesn't listen to me. Trustees, conference trustees. the conference trustees, in conjunction with the board of directors of the Bible camp, form a committee that oversee the Bible camp, but the conference trustees also and alone have responsibility for the property within the conference. And so in the event that, well, let's say, for example, for some reason the church is declared extinct. That means that the church has closed its doors and no longer active. The deeds are written such that the property reverts to the annual conference. Then the conference trustees are responsible for oversight of that property. And what that means is that they will determine the feasibility of maintaining the property, or if it's in the best interest of the conference to sell the property. If it's in the best interest of the conference to sell, then that property would be put up for sale, and when sold, the conference trustees would be the ones that would sign the papers to have that completed. And question then, it's not in this, but if that happens and the property is sold, what is done with the proceeds from that sale? Where does that money go? It goes to the annual conference, but let's be more specific. It goes to the Board of Church Extension. It's in the discipline that the proceeds from the sale of any property that belongs to the annual conference is put into the Board of Church Extension Fund, and that money is used for the for founding, for starting churches. It's money that's available for churches that want to take out a loan. The church can make an application to the Board of Church Extension, receive a loan at a low interest rate, and they would pay that money back to the conference then, and all the proceeds would go back into the Board of Church Extension Fund. So when you do look at the minutes and you look at the financial report, you'll see Board of Church Extension, and you'll see that it has a pretty good sum of money. It's not a huge sum, but it has a pretty good sum of money. That's why that money is there, is because property has been sold, and that money is sitting there waiting to be used for other things. Now, we do have a couple loans out, but those are also in the minutes as well, or in this case will be. Cemeteries are a little different. It depends on how, again, it depends on the deeds. But in most cases, cemeteries are incorporated separately from the church. Ours is, for example. The funds, even though we as a church elect the members for the cemetery committee, all of the funds for the cemetery are maintained separate from church funds. In fact, we even keep it in a separate bank because it's a completely different entity. I don't know. In the past, I don't think they have. I think that's something that they're beginning to do. I've never had to deal with a situation where we had a church that had a cemetery. The ones that I've dealt with did not have cemeteries, so it wasn't anything that was raised. But I've been involved in the sale of one property, but and I've seen some others that were done, but I don't think any of those had cemeteries with them. Well, and they should. That's why I said that's right. It's well, no, that's not entirely true now. It's a very costly proposition, but it has been done before. Cemeteries have been moved, but that's a last resort. And the best the best course for any church is for the church to work and keep itself operational and doing not just its normal business, but more importantly, doing the business of the kingdom, and so that the church can be viable, be alive, and do the work that needs to be done. That's what we prefer. I mentioned the district committee a moment ago. The district committee is, we've kind of changed the role of the district committee a little bit over the years. Originally, the district committee was the committee that was responsible for the investigation. If charges were brought against a minister or a church, then the district committee was the one that would be involved in that investigation. We've expanded those duties to provide to the president an advisory committee. And so the district committee now also functions as an advisory committee to the president. So if the president has a situation or something that they want some advice from or for, then the president would call the district committee in. If charges are made against an officer of the conference, the president, for example, then the district committee is the one who would have oversight of that. And they would meet, they would discuss that, and that would then go to the general conference level from that point. But the district committee is a standing committee that's available to the annual conference president. I mentioned the Board of Church Extension. They receive money from the conferences, from the conference for the furtherance of the conference through missions and oversight of the properties of the conference to ensure that none are in jeopardy by debt or otherwise. Funds received from the sale of church properties are placed in the treasury under the board for loan to churches, for purchasing property and building of church buildings or parsonages. And that is designated in the discipline. We've had some that have wanted to use those funds for other things, and my response to them has always been, you got to change the discipline first, because you can't spend that money for anything other than what's designated in the discipline. If you do, there are legal repercussions that you don't want to be involved in. So follow the book. That's what it's there for. Ministerial Education and Relations Committee. This is the committee that, let's say, for example, somebody in the church decides they've been praying and they feel like the Lord is leading them into the ministry, and so they're answering the call to preach. What do we do? What's the process for that? I'll get a little bit more into that process in just a moment. There's more detail in another slide. But just a general at this point is that person would be recommended to the annual conference, and they would come under the Ministerial Education and Relations Committee. This committee is responsible for oversight of the preparation of young preachers, of young ministers, as well as the ministerial relations and the education of those ministers. So, for example, one of the requirements that we have is that all ministers are supposed to get 3 CEU credits each year. This is the committee that's responsible to make sure that they do that and to provide for their education as well.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
All right, say someone in this church decided they wanted to be
Mm-hmm.
now, they would go through you or directly to.
Let me get to that in just a second. You are. A minister is one who is ordained. A preacher is one that's under the licensure of an official church board. So we use the term interchangeable, and that's fine. But in the discipline, when you see the term preacher and you see the term minister, that's the distinction. A preacher is one that's licensed to preach. A minister is one who is ordained. Minister has various responsibilities. His primary responsibility is to um, is to preach the gospel, to administer the ordinances, to execute the discipline, that's not to kill the discipline, but to carry it out, and to discharge all duties of the ministerial office. There are a lot of different responsibilities that we have. In fact, when you look in the discipline under this section, there are various duties that are assigned to the minister. I think there's 14 different paragraphs there of things that the minister is supposed to be doing. And so it's all there for us to know what our responsibilities are. One seeking ordination in the Methodist Protestant Church. How do we do that? So now we come to your question. All right, let's come back to that scenario that I started a moment ago. Young man decides that he wants to answer the call to the ministry. So he would come to me and say, hey, I feel like the Lord's talking to me about entering into the ministry. What do I do? I'll counsel with them, but I'll also meet with our official church board, who will select an examining committee. The examining committee could be made up of members of the church board and other members of the church. And the purpose of the examining committee is to do just that, to examine this young man that's wanting to enter into the ministry. There are some questions that are in the discipline that they're to ask anyone that's interested in entering into the ministry. They will ask those questions. That's not the only questions they have to ask, but they have to ask those questions. Those are required. We can add to it. You can't take away from it. And once the examining committee is satisfied with the testimony and the answers of the candidate for ministry, then they would report to the official church board and say, we have examined this young man, and we believe that they are a good candidate for the ministry, and we recommend that they be recommended to the conference. So the official church board then will write a letter of recommendation to the conference, and we would take that to the Ministerial Education Relations Committee. It can be done anytime during the year, because the MIR committee, that's what we call them, is a standing committee, and they meet throughout the year. So we would make that recommendation to them. No one can enter into the course of study without a recommendation from a local church board, from an official church board. That's the requirement. It has to be done. They may accept them tentatively, but without that letter of recommendation, they cannot be maintained under the Ministerial Education Relations Committee. So the church board makes that recommendation. The person will go. They will meet with the Ministerial Education Relations Committee, and when they are satisfied, they have questions that they're required to ask as well, that are different than the ones that the examining committee have to ask. When they're satisfied, again with the testimony and the answers of the candidate, then they will enter that person into the course of study. The course of study is laid out in the candidate handbook that is produced by the Board of Christian Education, and they would enter into a 3-year course of study. Now, a 3-year course of study doesn't mean they'll get it done in 3 years, but it's actually 3 levels is the way we have it in the handbook. Level 1, level 2, and level 3, and we changed that because of the implications. Some people look at it and say, well, I've got to do all this in a year, and if a person is working, maybe they're working full-time and trying to fulfill the requirements, it's sometimes difficult to do. But they'll go through the course of study, and they answer to the Ministerial Education Relations Committee, but they also are still answerable to the official church board. Each year, the church board will meet with the candidate and will write a letter of recommendation for the next year. And when they do that, they are able to grant a license to preach to him or her. But they cannot do that until they've met with them, and then they would make that recommendation until the person completes the course of study and is recommended for ordination. When the young man is ordained, then they move from being responsible to the church board to being answerable to the annual conference. That's the quick overview of it. There's a lot more that goes into it, but that's kind of the progression of how it goes.
What about a person who is a preacher coming from another denomination, who's been licensed by another denomination? What's the process?
The process is a little different there. They would still come to the local church. The examining committee would still meet with them and would still make a recommendation to the MIR committee, and they would go and meet with the MIR committee. If they have been ordained, if they are ordained in another denomination and they have their credentials, then we can either accept or not accept those credentials, depends on the church they come from and what was done in order to accomplish that. Because there are some cases where people are ordained without having to go through any type of training, education, or anything like that. And so that's one of the things that we try to look at, and if they have not done that, then there are certain things that we would recommend. They still would have to go through a 3-year probationary period. So they would not technically be members of the conference yet, but they would be on probation during those 3 years. And during that time, again, depending on what church or what denomination they come from, the MIR committee may have them do certain things. For example, one of the things that we do require all of them to go through is to study the discipline. They have to read through the discipline, different sections of it, each of the 3 years, and they have to attest that they will abide by the discipline. It stands to reason.
Do we have any right now that's in process?
We have 3, 4. I think we have 4 that are in the course of study right now. There's one other avenue towards ordination as well, and that would be the avenue that I took, and that is if you attend a Bible college. If you attend Bible college, then that takes the place of the course, the course of study. There are still additional requirements that may be applied, for example, studying the discipline, but you still have to go through the 3-year probationary period. That can happen consecutively or concomitantly with your studies, so that at the end of your when you graduate, you can be ordained at that time. Or if you did the studies beforehand, that can replace the course of study, and you go through the 3-year probationary period and would be ordained at the end of that time. But either of those methods are available, and that's all laid out in the handbook. Yes, it would. And if a person is coming in from a non-Wesleyan background, we would probably require some of the theology books from the course of study to be read through and studied as well. And that's what I said. If when we meet with that individual, we would determine their background and try to figure out if maybe they need a little bit of studies in some of the things that we believe, because not only are they attesting to the discipline, but they're also attesting to our doctrine. They have to agree with our doctrine and have to agree to preach and teach our doctrine. And if they're not going to do that, then we're not going to ordain them, because that's not what we need. If that's the case, then they need to go to a denomination that they can agree with. Already said that. On ordination, the minister is given a seat in the conference and is eligible to vote. So, a preacher that's in the course of study we call them an undergraduate. That's the term that we use in the conference. And in fact, if you look in in the composition of the conference, which shows the membership. There are sections for the undergraduates. There's a first year, second year, third year course of study, and they will fall into one of those categories based on where they're at with the MIR committee. The purpose of the course of study, as I said, is to adequately prepare new preachers to fulfill their call to the ministry and to provide a probationary period to ensure that the applicant is truly called and will answer to the authority of the conference. That truly called is one of the keys, because there are a lot of people that come up and say, you know, I think being a preacher would be a neat thing to do. I'm not sure who'd want to do that these days, but there are some people that, believe it or not, would do that. And so our purpose is then to weed out those that are not truly called, but that just think it's a neat idea. And we have had some that have entered into the course of study that after 1 or 2 years have dropped out because they really were not truly called. If a person is truly called to the ministry, you can't drop out. You shouldn't drop out. You won't. Not if you're truly called. God won't let you, yeah. No matter how hard I tried. The course of study is designed to aid in one's understanding of the Scripture, the doctrines of the church, and the administration of the local church. And so some of the different subjects that are included in the course of study. Obviously, the discipline, and it's broken out into scriptural studies and doctrinal studies, and then reading material. The doctrinal studies get into, we use H. Horton Wiley's theology book, which, by the way, if you're an insomniac, you have trouble sleeping, let me know. I'll let you borrow my Wiley's theology. I guarantee it'll put you to sleep. But it's really good reading. It's it's one of the best theology books for the Wesleyan doctrine that's available. It's just that Dr. Wiley was a smart man, and it's sometimes a dry subject. The purpose of the stationing committee is to assist the president in the assignment of pastors to the local church. And this is done primarily at conference, but the stationing committee is also a standing committee. And so if there is a reason to change pastors in the interim between conferences for whatever reason, then the president could call on the stationing committee to assist in finding a person to fill the pulpit and assigning that person to the pulpit. And that's something that has been done in the past as well. Is the decision of the stationing committee final? Yes or no? The short answer is no. The long answer is each party can appeal an assignment to the annual conference following the report from the stationing committee. So if you've ever been at annual conference, the last two reports that are given at conference are the stationing committee's report, or the pastoral assignments, and the appeals committee. So when the assignments are read, at that point, every delegate and every pastor has the opportunity to appeal their assignment. So if the church is not happy with the person that has been assigned to them, then when that's done, then they can make an appeal to the appeals committee, who would meet with them and work with them and with the stationing committee to try to come to an agreement. We actually had this happen, what was it, about 3 years ago, I think. It wasn't a major thing, but There was just a question that somebody had, I think. And, but the appeals process worked. And that's what it's there for, is to make sure that everyone is in agreement before conference dismisses. And we come to an agreement with that. We try to work with, and in fact, that's something the district committee, the stationing committee does during conference, is they'll meet with every pastor and every church that desires to meet with them. Now, if both the pastor and the church are in agreement that they're going to, the church wants the pastor back and the pastor's in agreement to going back, then it's not necessary for them to meet with the district, the stationing committee. But if one or the other has questions, then they can meet with them, or if they're desiring a change, then they would meet with the stationing committee, and they work through all of that at that point. It's been a pretty good process and has worked well for us. Did I miss? Okay. So what's a deaconess? Do you know a deaconess? Anybody know of any deaconesses? Diane Reed. Yes. Miss Beth Bailey was one as well. That's right. Miss Fay is actually an ordained minister. A deaconess is a woman who is, excuse me, is a woman who has been led by the Holy Spirit to devote herself to Christian service. She's a member of the local church and works under the authority of the local pastor. And so the deaconess works with the local pastor. There's certain functions that they may or may not do. And there is also a process for the deaconess as well. The deaconess would go through the deaconess board. The deaconess board is elected by the annual conference each year, or some of the members are elected each year anyway. It's a rolling committee. And there's a course of study in the discipline for the deaconess as well that they would go through. She would make application. She would make application to the deaconess board at the annual conference. They would meet with her. When they're satisfied with her, then they would enroll her in the course of study. And the course of study is similar to the ministerial course of study, but it's a scaled-down version of that. There's certain things that they're required to go through as well. And then once the deaconess board is satisfied with the studies of the deaconess, then she would be ordained at conference. And she's ordained similarly to that of a minister. They are under the conference as well. They're not voting members of the conference, but they are members of the conference. If you look at the composition, we also list deaconesses there as well. And in fact, when we do roll call, we include deaconesses in the roll call. We do. It's not as well defined in the discipline. That's one of the things that we've been looking at, and what the discipline is allowed for is what's called an exhorter, and we would give an exhorter's license to the male, and they would function similarly to that of a deaconess. They would have a similar training. In fact, that's again one of the things that the Board of Christian Education has been looking at this, and also I can't think of the term for it right this second that of what we're looking at, but we're preparing a course of study for them as well, and these would be. The only one that we had was Richard Garrett, that I can remember. I don't think we have anyone else at this point. We generally kind of encourage the men to move into the process for ordination, but not everyone feels called into the ministry to that level. And so we're trying to work with them in that regards, and make sure that that they have some education or some training in that area, not to the extent of ordination, but at least they have the basics, so that if they get up to exhort, which is basically to preach, then they would do so according to our doctrine and according to our discipline as well. Delegates to the General Conference. How are they selected? By vote. They're elected. When are they elected? No one is automatically a member of the General Conference. All members are elected. In fact, even the sitting president of the General Conference. Well, I'll get to that. We'll get to that next time. Let me not go there. I'm not finished yet. I don't even know what time it is. What time is it? Oh, it's just 6:49. I got 25 more minutes. Boy, dodge those daggers. I'm not going there. So, delegates to annual conference. It used to be that the delegates were elected at 2 o'clock on Friday of annual conference. That's what was in the discipline. Annual conference preceding general conference. So general conference is going to meet next in 2024. So next year, 2023, at annual conference is when delegates will be elected. That was changed for various reasons. So now the standard is delegates to the general conference are elected the conference preceding at the last business session. It's the first item of the last business session of the last on the last day of the annual conference. So if conference is slated to go Wednesday and Thursday, Thursday's the last day, the first business session Thursday morning, the conference will elect delegates to the general conference. Delegates are elected based on the standard of one minister and one lay delegate for every 250 members of the annual conference. So if you've been at conference, especially in the year that we were electing delegates, you will hear the secretary repeatedly asking, if you have not turned in your church reports, please turn in your church reports, because we need to know what your membership numbers are. And the reason we need to know what your membership numbers are is to determine how many delegates we are to elect to General Conference. Each conference will have a minimum of 2 ministers and 2 lay delegates. And that's what they're allotted. Now, they may not elect that many. They may only have 1 each. But they're allowed 2 delegates, regardless of what their membership numbers are. Just like with the annual conference, the general conference is the same way, that equal representation. 1 minister, 1 lay delegate. Additionally, they will elect each conference will elect a minister and a lay person to sit on the nominating committee for the general conference. And the sitting president of the general conference will meet with them prior to the general conference to go over nominations for the coming conference. Now, there are some positions that are required to be elected. by secret ballot, just like in the annual conference. The annual conference, for example, there are, I don't remember exactly now, the officers have to be elected by secret ballot. Nominations can be made, but you can elect anybody that you want to, as long as they're a member of the conference. But the president, the secretary, and the treasurer have to be elected by secret ballot. That's required by the discipline. Our bylaws require that the stationing committee is elected by secret ballot, and there's a couple others. The nominating committee is elected by secret ballot. The district committee is elected by secret ballot. And it seems like maybe there's one other one. But the others can be nominated through the nominating committee, and the nominating committee has to be elected. I think I said that one. Anyway. But next time, we will get into that discussion of the general conference and some of those questions that were raised tonight. Remember those and come back next week, and we'll delve into that. But general conference is laid out a little differently than the annual conference. One, because it's the umbrella. It overarches all of the annual conferences, and some of the elected officers are similar, the same, but there are also boards that are a little different in their function and in their purpose, and we'll get into some of that as well next week. We won't do a deep dive into it. If we did that, we'd be here for a while. But I do want to just do a general overview of how the general conference operates. And I don't plan to go into the judicial section of the discipline unless you want to. If you want to, we will, but I don't think that's necessary. Any questions, any comments on the annual conference? So you have a full understanding of the annual conference now, right?
Just enough to be dangerous.
Enough to be dangerous. We'll work on that. All right, if all hearts and minds are free, let's stand.